7 Buddhist Teachings for Inner Peace After 70. Let go and begin again. There's a moment that comes for many people around the age of 70. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. You're sitting quietly, maybe early morning, maybe late at night, and something shifts inside you, a kind of stillness you haven't felt before. And with it comes a question you can't quite ignore. Is this the end of something, or the beginning? Most of the world will tell you it's the end. The culture we live in worships youth, speed, and accumulation. By 70, you've watched the world move on without you in many ways. Children grown, career behind you, friends gone. The body's slower than you remember. And yet, the Buddha taught something that almost no one in the modern world talks about. He taught that the years after 70 carry a particular urgency, and within that urgency, a particular opportunity, not because life is somehow better now, but because the conditions for seeing clearly, for releasing what we've clung to for decades, are more present than they have ever been. The question is not whether life gets easier after 70. The question is whether you are willing to use this time well, whether you are willing, finally, to let go. Today, we're going to explore 7 Buddhist teachings that speak directly to where you are right now, and what becomes possible when you stop waiting and start seeing clearly. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share may completely change how you see where you are right now. 1. The burden you've been carrying without knowing it. There's a teaching in the Pali Canon, the oldest surviving record of the Buddha's words, about a man carrying a heavy raft on his back through a forest. He built the raft to cross a great river. It served him perfectly. But now he's on the other shore, and he's still carrying it through mud, over hills, exhausting himself, because he can't imagine putting it down. It saved him once, so he believes he must keep it forever. Now here is what makes this teaching so radical and so easy to miss. The Buddha was not just talking about career identity, or social roles, or the image we built over decades. He was pointing at something far deeper. He said, even the Dhamma itself, even the teachings, even the path is like a raft, to be used for crossing, not to be carried forever on your back. If even the Dhamma is not to be clung to, how much more so everything else we have identified with? By the time we reach 70, most of us are carrying decades of identity on our backs. Who we were in our career, what we achieved, what we failed to achieve, the roles we played: provider, parent, professional, protector, the reputation we built, the image we maintained. These things were real, they mattered, they carried us across rivers. But the Buddha's question cuts deeper than just, can you put down your job title? The question is, can you put down the very habit of needing to be someone? Can you release the grasping itself, not just what you grasp at? At 70, the invitation is not to find a truer version of yourself. It is to see clearly that the self you've been defending so carefully was never as solid as it appeared. And to notice how much effort has gone into maintaining something that was never quite real to begin with. That seeing, not the comfort of letting go, but the clarity of seeing, is the first act of freedom. 2. Why the things that once hurt you lose their power. One of the quietest truths I've encountered in Theravada teaching is this: suffering doesn't come from what happens to us. It comes from our relationship with what happens to us. When we're young, we have enormous energy, but we're also deeply reactive. A harsh word lands like a wound. A failure feels like an identity. A loss can unravel us for years. This isn't weakness. It's simply what happens when we are still deeply invested in maintaining a sense of self, still fighting to establish and protect who we believe we are. But something can change with age. And Buddhism describes this possibility with precise language. The Pali word is upekkha, equanimity. It's not indifference, it's not numbness. It's the capacity to remain steady in the presence of both joy and difficulty, without being swept away by either. Now I want to be careful here, because this is where many teachings get it wrong. Upekkha does not arise automatically with age. The Buddha was clear. Equanimity is cultivated through careful attention, through meditation, through yanaizo manasikara, which means wise reflection on experience. Age alone does not produce it. We all know people who have grown old and grown only more bitter, more rigid, more defended. What age can do, if we meet it with honest awareness, is provide conditions. A long life gives us more material to work with, more suffering observed, more change witnessed, more proof available in direct experience that clinging causes pain and releasing brings relief. By 70, if you have been paying attention, not just living, but actually observing your own experience, you have more material for that seeing than almost anyone. Suffering alone doesn't produce wisdom, but suffering, met with honest attention and a willingness to investigate, can become the ground from which equanimity grows. What once broke you can lose its power, not because you've become unbreakable, but because you've begun to see more clearly what was actually happening all along. 3. The freedom of having less to prove. In the early Buddhist texts, the monks and nuns who were praised most highly were often the oldest. Not because they had accumulated the most knowledge, but because they had released the most need. There's a particular kind of suffering that almost no one names directly, the suffering of needing to be seen a certain way. We spend most of our lives managing impressions, performing competence, hiding uncertainty, trying to appear more successful, more composed, more together than we feel. This performance is exhausting. And most of us don't even realize we're doing it. It's so deeply embedded in how we move through the world. The Buddha described this with precision. He taught about the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, gain and loss, fame and disrepute, pleasure and pain. These 8 forces, he said, are what the untrained mind spends its entire life chasing and fleeing. We build our identities around securing the pleasant ones and avoiding the painful ones. And in doing so, we are never still. At 70, something remarkable becomes possible. The audience that once mattered so much, colleagues, competitors, people whose approval you sought, has largely dispersed. The race you were running has reached its natural conclusion. And you find yourself standing in an open field with a strange, unfamiliar feeling. You don't have to perform anymore. The Buddha described the liberated mind as one that is free from the need for approval, free from the fear of blame. He wasn't just describing enlightenment as a distant ideal. He was pointing at something that becomes genuinely available when you've lived long enough to see through the performance. You've already proven what you needed to prove, or you've accepted that the proving was never really the point. Either way, the grip of the worldly winds begins to loosen. And in that loosening, for perhaps the first time, there is space to simply be present without agenda, without performance, without the exhausting weight of needing the world to see you a certain way. That loosening is not nothing. That loosening is the beginning of something real. 4. What the Buddha said about the body getting older, this one I want to speak about honestly, because I think it's where many people struggle most. The body changes after 70, sometimes dramatically, and the culture we live in, which prizes physical youth above almost everything, offers very little wisdom for navigating this with dignity. Buddhism offers something different, but I want to be careful not to make it sound easier than it is. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha himself in his 80s, near the end of his life, speaks openly about the aging of his own body. He says, "My body is like an old cart held together with straps." He doesn't say this with despair, but he doesn't romanticize it either. He says it with the clear, unblinking honesty that characterized everything he taught. This is important. The body's decline is real. The aches are real. The limitations are real. The losses are real. Theravada Buddhism does not ask you to pretend otherwise, or to reframe pain as secretly beautiful. What the Buddha pointed to was something different, that even as the body decays, the capacity for clear awareness does not have to decay with it. In the same sutta, he tells his monks, "Dwell with yourselves as your own island, your own refuge, with the Dhamma as your island." The Dhamma as your refuge. The body and the mind are not the same thing. The body's diminishment does not require the mind's diminishment. And for those willing to practice, to sit, to observe, to investigate, the enforced stillness that aging brings can become a genuine support for meditation in ways that the busyness of earlier life never allowed. Many of the most profound practitioners in the Theravada tradition had their deepest realizations not in the vigor of youth, but in the stillness of age. Not because aging is spiritual, but because they used the conditions aging provided and kept practicing. The body slowing down is not the enemy of the spiritual life. But it is also not automatically its beginning. What matters is what you do with the stillness. 5. The Buddhist teaching on time that changes everything here is something that took me a long time to understand about Buddhist philosophy. In the West, we tend to experience time as a straight line, past behind us, future ahead, present barely a sliver between the two. And we spend most of our lives either regretting the past or anxious about the future, with very little time in the only place where life is actually happening. Buddhism describes this as one of the fundamental sources of human suffering. The Pali term is papanka, often translated as the proliferation of mind. But it means something more specific than ordinary distraction. Papanka in the Nikaya texts refers to the way the mind compounds raw experience with layers of craving, conceit, and fixed views, turning a simple moment of seeing or hearing into an elaborate story about who we are, what we need, and what threatens us. We are not just distracted, we are constructing a fictional world and then suffering inside it. The antidote the Buddha pointed to was not simply be more present. It was to see clearly the mechanism by which the mind proliferates and to stop feeding it. Now here is what changes at 70 for many people. The future shortens. And while this can feel frightening, it can also, if met with awareness, loosen the grip of papanka. When there is less future to project onto, the mind has fewer stories to construct. The urgency of clinging begins to reveal itself as what it always was, unnecessary. This is not resignation. The present moment, in Theravada practice, is not a destination to arrive at or a fullness to be enjoyed. It is the only place where experience is actually occurring, and therefore the only place where clinging can be seen, investigated, and released. People who have done this inner work, who have met their experience honestly rather than continuously escaping into mental commentary, often describe a quality of presence, a clarity in ordinary moments that they never accessed when they were younger and busier. The cup of tea in the morning, the light on the garden, the grandchild's laugh, the silence before sleep, these were always there. The practice was always available. What age can provide is the conditions to finally stop running from it. 6. The Buddhist teaching on friendship and letting go. This teaching may be the most uncomfortable, and I want to present it carefully because it is easy to misuse. Buddhism is not sentimental about relationships, it is honest about them. In the Sigalovada Sutta, the Buddha speaks in detail about friendship, what true friendship looks like, and what it asks of us. He describes genuine friends as those who help in difficulty, who remain constant through hardship, who offer honest counsel, and who meet suffering with compassion. These, the Buddha says, are the relationships worth tending with great care. But notice what the Buddha emphasizes. Not what we get from relationships, but what we give. The teaching is primarily about how to be a good friend, how to show up with generosity, loyalty, honesty, and metta. There is something quietly confronting about that. At 70, looking back at a lifetime of relationships, the honest question is not who was truly there for me. The honest question is, how often was I truly there for others, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but with genuine attention and goodwill. Metta, loving kindness, in the Theravada tradition is unconditional. It is not something we offer selectively to people who make us feel good. The Metta Sutta asks us to extend goodwill to all beings, without exception, the way a mother protects her only child. This does not mean we have no discernment. As we age, it is natural that some relationships fall away, roles change, circumstances shift, people move in different directions. That is simply impermanence at work in our lives. But the Theravada teaching here is not a permission to curate relationships for our own comfort. It is an invitation to ask a different question, not does this relationship nourish me, but am I showing up in this relationship with honesty, generosity, and genuine goodwill? At 70, the deepest freedom is not in choosing who deserves your presence. It is in bringing metta, real, unconditional goodwill, to everyone your life touches, whether you see them often or rarely. That is the freedom the Buddha was pointing to. 7. The one question that unlocks everything after 70 in the Theravada tradition. There is a practice given to serious practitioners, not as a morbid exercise, but as one of the most clarifying practices in all of Buddhist meditation. It is the contemplation of death, not to frighten, not to depress, but to burn away everything that isn't real. The Buddha taught that most human suffering comes from moha, delusion. The delusion that we are permanent, that the things we cling to will last, that there is always more time. When you contemplate your own mortality honestly, not as a distant abstraction but as a lived reality, something extraordinary happens. The unimportant falls away. The trivial stops feeling urgent. The petty grievances, the old resentments, the status games, the comparisons, they lose their grip. And what remains is what has always mattered. At 70, you are closer to this clarity than you have ever been. Not because death is near, it may or may not be, but because you have lived enough to know, at some level, that this is finite. That time is not a resource you can assume. The question the Buddha would ask you is not, how much time do you have left? The question is, knowing what you know now, what will you give your remaining days to? Not in the sense of a bucket list. Not in the sense of finally living your best life, but in the deepest sense, what is worth your attention, your energy, your awareness right now? That question held honestly is not frightening. It is the most clarifying, most freeing question a human being can ask. And living inside that question, not just answering it once, but returning to it again and again, is itself a practice. So let's come back to where we began. That quiet moment sitting alone, feeling that something is shifting. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching after his enlightenment. By the time he died, he was in his 80s. And those who were with him at the end described not a man diminished by age, but a man who had used every remaining moment of his life fully, who had not wasted the time he was given. That is the possibility that Buddhism points to, not a more comfortable life, not a more fulfilling chapter, but a more awake one. A life in which we stop postponing the seeing, stop waiting for the right conditions, stop assuming there is more time. After 70, the conditions for this are present in a way they may not have been before. The roles have fallen away. The performances have exhausted themselves. The future has become visible as finite. This is not a diminishment. It is, if you are willing to use it, an invitation to practice with greater honesty and greater urgency than ever before. You are not at the end. But you are also not at the beginning of something comfortable. You are at the beginning of something real. If this teaching has offered you something today, I hope you'll carry it gently into your day. And if you know someone who is navigating this chapter of life, a parent, a friend, Someone who needs to hear that where they are holds real possibility. Please share this with them. That small act of passing on wisdom is itself a Buddhist practice. Thank you for being here.